Hey everyone, this is chapter 1 of C.L.R. James, A Political uh, Biography by Kent Worcester. Chapter 1's titled Beyond a Boundary. Did I say that already? I don't know. Come on, you piece of shit. Any chance of this thing cooperating here? Okay, so this is the first chapter of part 1, and it starts with a quote. Quote, "A man with a reflective turn of mind, walking through an exhibition of this sort, will not be oppressed, I take it, by his own or other people's hilarity. An episode of humor or kindness touches and amuses him here and there. When you come home, you sit down in a sober, contemplative, not uncharitable frame of mind, and apply yourself to your books or your business." End quote. William Thackeray, Vanity Fair, a novel without a hero. Wikipedia says Vanity Fair, the novel, is a novel by the English author William Makepeace Thackeray, which follows the lives of Becky Sharp and Amelia Sedley amid their friends and families during and after the Napoleonic Wars. It was first published as a 19-volume monthly serial, the last containing parts 19 and 20, from 1847 to 1848, carrying the subtitle Pen and Pencil Sketches of English Society, which reflects both its satirization of early 19th century British society and the many illustrations drawn by Thackeray to accompany the text. It was published as a single volume in 1848 with the subtitle A Novel Without a Hero, reflecting Thackeray's interest in deconstructing his era's conventions regarding literary heroism. It is sometimes considered the, quote, principal founder, end quote, of the Victorian domestic model. The story of Vanity Fair is framed as a puppet play, and the narrator, despite being an authorial voice, is somewhat unreliable. The serial was a popular and critical success. The novel is now considered a classic and has inspired several audio, film, and television adaptations. It also inspired the title of the British lifestyle magazine, first published in 1868, which became known for its caricatures of famous people of Victorian and Edwardian society. In 2003, Vanity Fair was listed at number 122 on the BBC's The Big Read poll of the UK's best-loved books. And the Wikipedia says William Thackeray lived from 1811 to 1863 and was an English novelist and illustrator. He is known for his satirical works, particularly his 1847 to 48 novel Vanity Fair, a panoramic portrait of British society, and the 1844 novel The Luck of Barry Lyndon, which was adapted for a 1975 film by Stanley Kubrick. If you like movies, you should see that movie. Thackeray was born in Calcutta, British India, and was sent to England after his father's death in 1815. He studied at various schools and briefly attended Trinity College, Cambridge, before leaving to travel Europe. Thackeray squandered much of his inheritance on gambling and unsuccessful newspapers. Thackeray turned to journalism to support his family, primarily working for Fraser's magazine, The Times, and Punch. William Thackeray's wife, Isabella, suffered from mental illness. Thackeray gained fame from his novel Vanity Fair and produced several other notable works. Thackeray unsuccessfully ran for Parliament in 1857 and edited the Cornhill magazine in 1860. Thackeray's health declined due to excessive eating, drinking, and lack of exercise. Thackeray died from a stroke at the age of 52. Thackeray began as a satirist and parodist, gaining popularity through works that showcased his fondness for roguish characters. Thackeray's early works were marked by savage attacks on high society, military prowess, marriage, and hypocrisy, often written under various pseudonyms. Thackeray's writing career began with satirical sketches like The Yellow Plush Papers. Thackeray's later novels, such as Pendennis and The Newcomes, reflected a mellowing in his tone, focusing on the coming of age of characters and critical portrayals of society. During the Victorian era, Thackeray was ranked second to Charles Dickens, but is now primarily known for Vanity Fair. Thank you for that detour. Back to the text. And now we can start chapter 1. Beyond a Boundary. Cyril Lionel Robert James was born in the village of Coroni, Trinidad, on the 4th of January 1901. James was the eldest of 3 children. His parents, Robert Alexander and Ida Elizabeth Bessie James, were hard-working, respectable members of the community who expected that their 3 children, CLR, Olive, and Eric, would concentrate on their studies and one day make a contribution to the wider society. The James family had solid working class and West Indian roots. Both of CLR's grandfathers were skilled craftsmen who had immigrated to Trinidad from Barbados during the second half of the 19th century, and Bessie Rudder, James's mother, was herself born on Barbados. In Trinidad, James's paternal grandfather found employment as a, quote, pan boiler on a sugar estate, ... a post in those days usually held by white men, end quote. Footnote. C.L.R. James, Beyond a Boundary, page 117. Wikipedia says Beyond a Boundary, 1963, is a memoir on cricket written by the Trinidadian Marxist intellectual C.L.R. James, which James describes as, quote, neither cricket reminiscences nor autobiography, end quote. It mixes social commentary, particularly on the place of cricket in the West Indies and England, with commentary on the game, arguing that what happened inside the, quote, boundary line, end quote, in cricket affected life beyond it, as well as the converse. The book is in a sense a response to a quote from Rudyard Kipling's poem, The English Flag. Quote, what should they know of England who only England know, end quote, which James in his preface revised to, quote, what do they know of cricket who only cricket know, end quote. Back to the text. James's maternal grandfather, Josh Rudder, held the post of engine driver on the Trinidad Government Railway and was responsible for the run between San Fernando and Prince's Town, while one of his cousins, Cudjoe, worked as a blacksmith. Sheltered from the harsher aspects of the colonial economy, James's immediate family aspired to a stable middle-class status. Robert Alexander worked as a school teacher and principal, while Bessie performed various duties around the home and the community. In the eyes of both parents, and of the many neighbors and assorted family members who lived in sometimes remarkably close proximity to the family, it was up to the next generation to ensure that the Jameses cemented their middle-class station in West Indian society. This supportive, close-knit, and propriety-conscious home environment left an indelible impression on CLR and his younger siblings, but it was by no means the only influence at work in James's childhood and adolescence. The family was itself part of a dense network of overlapping groups, from teachers and clergy to shopkeepers and schoolchildren, who helped constitute the broader milieu within which family members operated. Not surprisingly, school was a particularly important influence, providing a powerful source of friendships, ideas, and aspirations. For C.L.R. James, school initially meant his father's classroom, where he studied as a little boy, and later Queen's Royal College, the most prestigious school on the island. Another key influence was games and sport, especially cricket, which his family and teachers mostly encouraged and which James readily embraced from an early age. Finally, books, newspapers, and magazines formed a ubiquitous element in James' daily life. While family, friends, and school authorities recognized his talents, this exposure to the world of books and print, literature, biography, history, journalism, helped turn James into an intellectual and placed James on the path of a writing career. Long after James had graduated from school, history and literature remained two of the central pursuits of his peripatetic life. One author who made a particularly powerful impression was William Thackeray. In the autobiographical Beyond a Boundary, published in 1963, we learned that James read Thackeray's Vanity Fair several times a year on average throughout his adolescence. Thackeray's satirical dissection of English middle and upper class manners during the early part of the 19th century must have held a great fascination for the precocious son of Bessie and Robert Alexander. But from a very early age, C.L.R. James seems to have been conscious of the role of conventions and rituals in society, the overdetermined interaction of the individual personality and the wider social environment. It is almost as if by nature he was a literary anthropologist, one who readily responded to Thackeray's wicked characterizations and brilliant vignettes. New section. Although his father later moved up to positions of authority within the school system, the early years were no bed of roses. For nearly a decade, the family divides its time between Coroni's larger neighbor, Tunapuna, and the village of North Trace, where Robert Alexander found employment as a schoolmaster. The schoolhouse in North Trace was tiny, and yet James' father was entrusted with the education of over 100 children of various ages who walked barefoot into town from neighboring villages. The family home in Tunapuna was also cramped. In a letter written to his close confidant, Constance Webb, C.L.R. James described the house as initially having, quote, 2 rooms, one divided by a paper blind, end quote. C.L.R. described the house as initially having, quote, 2 rooms, one divided by a paper blind, end quote. Added together, both rooms were only, quote, about 12 feet by 18 feet, end quote. The house was so old that, quote, there were holes in the floor, ... It had a thatched roof, and the rain came in, end quote. James went on to report that the entire extended family, 2 parents, 3 children, 2 aunts, Judith and Ava, and his maternal grandmother, crowded into these 2 rooms. Quote, my aunts were in their early 20s. My grandmother was about 65. They washed clothes for a living, and my aunts also were seamstresses, end quote. James. Footnote. Letter from C.L.R. James to Constance Webb, July 1944, titled Autobiography of a Man by Him. This letter contains a wealth of information about James' earliest years. Along with 2 other letters, it is reprinted in Paget Henry and Paul Boule's edited volume C.L.R. James's Caribbean. This passage appears on page 20. C.L.R. James's Caribbean was edited by Paget Henry and Paul Boule, and the description says, for more than half a century, C.L.R. James, who lived from 1901 to 1989, the, quote, Black Plato, as coined by the London Times, has been an internationally renowned revolutionary thinker, writer, and activist. Born in Trinidad, James's lifelong work was devoted to understanding and transforming race and class exploitation in his native West Indies, as well as in Britain and the United States. In C.L.R. James's Caribbean, noted scholars examine the roots of both James's life and oeuvre in connection with the economic, social, and political environment of the West Indies. Drawing upon James's observations on his own life, as revealed to interviewers and close friends, this volume provides an examination of James's childhood and early years as colonial literateur and his massive contribution to West Indian political cultural understanding. Moving beyond previous biographical interpretations, the contributors here take up the problem of reading James's text in light of post-structuralist criticism, the implication of his text for Marxist discourse, and for problems of Caribbean development. Back to the text and footnote. Despite these claustrophobic conditions, Tunapuna, North Trace, and indeed Trinidad itself offered a marvelous setting for the development of a young man's empathic gifts. Empathic gifts. At the turn of the century, Tunapuna, located approximately 9 miles from the capital in a prosperous agricultural belt, was little more than a provincial village. Slavery, outlawed in 1834, was still a living memory for a handful of the town's residents. Nearby Port of Spain was a small but bustling city, a, quote, microcosm of the world's peoples, end quote. Footnote. Selwyn D. Ryan, Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago, published 1972 with Toronto Press, University of Toronto Press. The description for Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago, a study of decolonization in a multiracial society, says, study on race relations, nationalism, and politics in Trinidad and Tobago covers Caribbean history from 1919 to the present, examines the role of political parties and interest groups, economic resources, and racial conflicts, and explains the failure of the radical decolonization assumed by nationalists and the absence of a socially relevant development policy. References and statistical tables. Back to the text and footnote. North Trace, by way of comparison, was a tiny settlement lodged deep in the country's southern central interior. As someone fortunate enough to call all three places, quote, home at one time or another, James exhibited a real knack for moving around, making new friends, and talking to people from all kinds of backgrounds. The experience of migration, which is central to the notion of the Caribbean as a place of recent settlement, was deeply etched into the pattern of James's childhood. Through all the commuting and relocations, Robert Alexander and Bessie sought to provide their 3 children with a secure environment and a stable set of values. As family patriarch, Robert Alexander was austere, detached, and analytical in nature, and he demanded a great deal from his students and his children. Robert Alexander James worked as a teacher and a school principal for his entire adult life, not only within the public school system but as a private tutor on weekends. Robert Alexander James's main subjects were composition and grammar, but he also taught musical theory, and his nephew, Cyril Alston, recalls that he had mastered the Pitman method of shorthand. Footnote. Heather Cattu, interview with Cyril Alston, May 1993, Port of Spain. Cyril Alston reports that James's father prided himself on the use of his middle name. End footnote. After his retirement, at the age of 60, several years after his son had left Trinidad to pursue a literary career in the metropolis, Robert Alexander James continued to tutor individual students and worked as a correspondent for the Port of Spain Gazette. Within the school system, Robert Alexander James was known as a first-rate teacher, trainer, and administrator, and Robert Alexander James received a number of promotions. As headmaster, one of Robert Alexander James's primary tasks was ensuring that his students passed the annual scholastic examination, but it was apparent early on that his eldest son had a special gift for scholarly pursuits, particularly reading and composition. When CLR was 8 years old, his father began tutoring him for a special island-wide scholarship competition, which enabled families of modest means to send their brightest sons to Queen's Royal College. By 1910, this promising pupil was one of 4 entrants to obtain a scholarship, or quote, exhibition, to what has long been regarded as Trinidad's finest secondary school. No one had ever won an exhibition at such an early age. James later boasted that as a child he was, quote, bright as a new shilling, and everybody said I would be sure to be something one day, end quote. Footnote. Letter from CLR James to Constance Webb, September 13, 1944, reprinted in Henry and Boole's edited volume, CLR James's Caribbean. End footnote. It seems likely that his special status as the eldest son and prize student of the area's schoolmaster would have ensured that James was detached in some sense from his immediate peer group, but James had a friendly manner and got along well with everyone. The transition from the schoolhouse in North Trace to Queen's Royal College was certainly eventful, even momentous, but it was shrouded in an air of inevitability. As a staunch believer in personal discipline and corporal punishment, Robert Alexander was especially strict with his eldest son, who nevertheless rebelled at school and spent more time playing sports and reading novels than reciting Latin. While he was proud of his son's scholarship, he disapproved of his decision to pursue a full-time literary career. C.L.R. later said that his father, quote, didn't like the writing business too much, but if I was going to write, I should write something that the newspapers would accept, end quote. He derided his father as a, quote, Philistine of note, end quote, and claimed that he had wanted him to pursue a career in the public sector, which offered the prospect of a decent pension. Footnote. Bull, The Making of a Literary Life, C.L.R. James interviewed in Henry and Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Caribbean. End footnote. Okay, where am I? While C.L.R. may have admired and consciously emulated his father's code of propriety and civility, his unconventional career aspirations and radical politics were something else again. In this sense, C.L.R. fulfilled the mandate of the 14th-century Arab proverb, which holds that, quote, men resemble their time more than their fathers, end quote. Footnote, quoted in Guy Debord Comments on the Society of the Spectacle. Published with Verso, 1990. The description for this book says, first published in 1967, Guy Debord's stinging revolutionary critique of contemporary society, the Society of the Spectacle, has since acquired a cult status, credited by many as being the inspiration for the ideas generated by the events of May 1968 in France. Debord's pitiless attack on commodity fetishism and its incrustation in the practices of everyday life continues to burn brightly in today's age of satellite television and the soundbite. In Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, published 20 years later, Debord returned to the themes of his previous analysis and demonstrated how they were all the more relevant in a period when the, quote, integrated spectacle was dominant. Resolutely refusing to be reconciled to the system, Debord trenchantly slices through the doxa and mystification offered tip by journalists and pundits to show how aspects of reality as diverse as terrorism and the environment, the mafia and the media, were caught up in the logic of spectacular society. Pointing the finger clearly at those who benefit from the logic of domination, Debord's comments convey the revolutionary impulse at the heart of situationism. Back to the text and footnote. Although both parents shared the same religious affiliation, Bessie James of the families devout Anglican. To neighbors and friends, Bessie James was known as, quote, Aunt Bessie. And Bessie James left a deep and lasting impression on family and friends. James later described Bessie James as, quote, a very tall woman, my color, with a superb carriage, and so handsome that everybody always asked who she was, end quote. James, C.L.R. James. James remarked that Bessie James, quote, dressed in the latest fashion, she had a passion for dress and was herself a finished seamstress, end quote. But C.L.R. James's most important recollection was that Bessie James, quote, read everything that came her way, end quote. James later wrote, quote, I can see her now sitting very straight with the book held high, her pince-nez on her Caucasian nose, reading till long after midnight. If I got up there, she was reading The book still held high. As she read a book and put it down, I picked it up, end quote. James. Footnote. Letter from CLR James to Constance Webb, July 1944, reprinted in Henry and Bull's edited volume, CLR James's Caribbean. End footnote. As a result of Bessie James's varied reading habits, CLR James was exposed to a raft of highbrow authors, including not only Thackeray, but also Jane Austen, Arnold Bennett, the Bronte sisters, Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, William Shakespeare, and Anthony Trollope, as well as popular writers such as W.G. Wodehouse. Charles Dickens was a particular favorite, but Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy was also made a lasting impression. Footnote. The influence of Culture and Anarchy may be registered at many different sites within the Jamesian corpus. Arnold's high Victorian polemic certainly affirmed James's broad conception of culture and his belief in the importance of education and knowledge, as well as personal qualities such as rectitude and perseverance. For this reason, it is surely not an accident that Culture and Anarchy is loaded with formulations that can easily be transposed into Jamesian rhetoric. For example, quote, Culture says, quote, consider these people, then, their way of life, their habits, their manners, the very tones of their voice. Look at them attentively, observe the literature they read, the things which give them pleasure, the words which come forth out of their mouths, the thoughts which make the furniture of their minds, ... end quote. Another example, quote, in all directions, our habitual courses of action seem to be losing efficaciousness, credit, and control, both with others and even with ourselves. Everywhere we see the beginnings of confusion, and we want a clue to some sound order and authority. This we can only get by going back upon the actual instincts and forces which rule our life, seeing them as they really are, connecting them with other instincts and forces, enlarging our whole view and rule of life, end quote. Matthew Arnold, Culture and Anarchy. So, Wikipedia says Culture and Anarchy, an essay in political and social criticism, is a series of periodical essays by Matthew Arnold, first published in Cornhill Magazine 1867-68 and collected as a book in 1869. The preface was added in 1869. Matthew Arnold's famous piece of writing on culture established his high Victorian cultural agenda, which remained dominant in debate from the 1860s until the 1950s. According to Matthew Arnold's view, advanced in the book, quote, culture is a study of perfection, end quote. He went further that, quote, culture seeks to do away with classes, to make the best that has been thought and known in the world current everywhere, to make all men live in an atmosphere of sweetness and light, end quote. Matthew Arnold's often quoted phrase, quote, culture is the best which has been thought and said, end quote, comes from the preface to Culture and Anarchy. Quote, the whole scope of the essay is to recommend culture as the great help out of our present difficulties, culture being a pursuit of our total perfection by means of getting to know, on all the matters which most concern us, the best which has been thought and said in the world, and through this knowledge, turning a stream of fresh and free thought upon our stock notions and habits, which we now follow staunchly but mechanically, vainly imagining that there is a virtue in following them staunchly, which makes up for the mischief of following them mechanically, end quote. The book contains most of the terms culture, sweetness and light, barbarian, Philistine, Hebraism, and many others which are more associated with Arnold's work's influence. And the Wikipedia for Matthew Arnold says, Matthew Arnold lived from 1822 to 1888 and was an English poet and cultural critic. Matthew Arnold was the son of Thomas Arnold, the headmaster of Rugby School, and brother to both Tom Arnold, literary professor, and William Delafield Arnold, novelist and colonial administrator. Matthew Arnold has been characterized as a sage writer, a type of writer who chastises and instructs the reader on contemporary social issues. Matthew Arnold was also an inspector of schools for 35 years and supported the concept of state-regulated secondary education. Back to the text and footnote. The works of these authors were supplemented by a daily diet of newspapers and magazines. While his mother approved of James's preoccupation with words, Bessie James may not have fully appreciated the nature of his literary gifts. James later remembered one incident in particular, quote, "When I was about 7, I sat up late one night and wrote a poem, about 8 verses of 4 lines each in imitation of a poem in my reading book. Why I felt to write I do not know. No one wrote that I know. No one had ever said that people wrote. Another day my mother put down The Last of the Mohicans. I picked it up and read it. I read as she did, straight through, except when I saw a chance of playing cricket or shooting with an air gun. When I finished The Last of the Mohicans, I got a copybook and began to write a story of my own. But after 2 chapters, my mother read it and said it was exactly like The Last of the Mohicans, and I stopped. I now know that this was the worst thing she could have done." End quote. Footnote: Letter from C.L.R. James to Constance Webb, reprinted in Henry and Boole's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Caribbean. End footnote. Despite this tactical error, Bessie was supportive of her son's enthusiasms and tolerant of his individuality. Perhaps what he valued most in their relationship was the emotional space she allowed him to establish between himself and the rest of the family. James would later spend far more time reminiscing about his mother than his father, siblings, or relatives. In this context, it seems hardly accidental that his only novel, Mint Valley, is dedicated, quote, "to my mother, not both parents." Minty Alley. Wikipedia says Minty Alley is a novel written by Trinidadian writer C.L.R. James in the late 1920s and published in London by Secker and Warburg in 1936 as West Indian literature was starting to flourish. It was the first novel by a black West Indian to be published in England and, quote, "earned much praise for its sensitive portrayal of the poor, especially poor women, and for its playful use of the folkloric trickster tradition in a modern context," end quote. According to Christian Hogsbjerg, James later noted, quote, "the basic constituent of my political activity and outlook," end quote, was already set out in the, quote, "human," end quote, aspect of Mint Alley, the unpublished novel he wrote in 1928 about the working people of one, quote, barrack yard he stayed in that summer, end quote. James arrived in the United Kingdom in 1932, intent on a career as a writer and bearing the manuscript of Minty Alley, and found employment writing about cricket for the Manchester Guardian. C.L.R. James became involved in politics, writing books about the Bolshevik Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, leaving his literary ambitions behind. Minty Alley was his only novel. James died in London in 1989. Back to the text. Yet before James left Trinidad, James was extremely close to both siblings, who admired and looked up to their elder brother. Eric and Olive knew their brother as, quote, Nello, which was the family nickname, and which became the name that James was known throughout the West Indies. In later years, both siblings took pride in their brother's achievements, although there was a certain amount of tension over the fact that he spent so much time abroad, even during the long years of his mother's illness in the 1930s and 1940s. As far as the father-son relationship is concerned, it was difficult and at times stressful. Robert Alexander gave the impression that he was never quite satisfied with his son's efforts. He regularly voiced doubts about whether CLR would be able to earn a living and provide for a family. Their relationship was at its most strained during James's adolescence, where their arguments centered around his extracurricular activities and his performance at school. In an essay written in the 1970s, CLR described a recurrent nightmare where he would bring home an inadequate report card and face his father's wrath. The nightmare went away only after he had become a successful author. Footnote. Quote, the report would come. It would say that I was not trying. My father would be very angry and I would be upset for days. I got that dream steadily after I had left school, ... But the moment I had written a book, World Revolution, a piece of work which was recognized everywhere as worthwhile, that dream disappeared and I have never had it since, end quote. The essay is entitled My Experience with Women. A copy is in the author's private collection. End footnote. Under the tutelage of their parents, all three children became, quote, very well trained, end quote, in the area of manners and good grace. Quote, my mother saw to that, end quote. CLR later wrote, quote, respect for elders, good manners at table, modesty, and self-respect, end quote. This cultivation of proper behavior took place in a climate of economic uncertainty. Quote, my father made about $40 or $50 a month and was always desperately in debt, but he always dressed my mother well and we never needed anything. My mother kept us scrupulously clean and kept the house the same as did my aunts. End quote. Despite their financial anxieties, the family occupied a privileged niche in the local community. Quote, I was somehow aware, end quote, James confessed, quote, that we were not common people or laborers, end quote. James. Footnote. Letter from CLR James to Constance Webb, July 1944, reprinted in Henry and Bull's edited volume CLR James's Caribbean. End footnote. At the same time that Bessie and Robert Alexander were working to instill a sense of moral values in their children, they're also committed to maintaining certain social conventions. For this reason, his mother and aunts made it clear to CLR that CLR was not to socialize with neighborhood ruffians like Matthew Bondman. Bondman was, quote, an awful character, end quote, who, quote, would not work, end quote, but he was a graceful batsman. He would, quote, often without shame walk up the main street barefooted, quote, with his planks on the ground, end quote, as my grandmother would report. He did it often, and my grandmother must have seen it hundreds of times, but she never failed to report it, as if she had suddenly seen the parson walking down the street barefooted, end quote. Footnote, James Beyond a Boundary. As this anecdote suggests, CLR James grew up in a socially self-conscious environment. Although he had access to the works of many different authors, the household's general atmosphere was one of moralism, status consciousness, and religious piety. As the emblem of the family's hope for the future, CLR was burdened with an extraordinary set of pressures and expectations. But at the same time, he was cushioned and protected, and at least on his mother's side, there was no doubt that he was also loved. James's family and his later schoolmasters were largely successful in their attempts to raise this prodigal son in accordance to the public school code of Victorian England. One writer has summarized this code as a matter of upholding, quote, the standards of fair play, end quote. Quote, do not play for personal ambitions, but for the team's. Keep your head when the fortunes of a game have swung against your team. Do not criticize teammates for failures, and do not withhold praise from opponents who are succeeding, ... End quote. Footnote, Jervis Anderson, Cricket and Beyond, The Career of CLR James, published in American Scholar, summer 1985. End footnote. Or as James later remembered, quote, I never cheated, I never appealed for a decision unless I thought the batsman was out. I never argued with the umpire, I never jeered at a defeated opponent, I never gave to a friend a vote or a place which, by any stretch of the imagination, could be seen as belonging to an enemy or to a stranger, ... End quote. This moral code became, quote, the framework of my existence, It has never left me, end quote. Footnote, James, Beyond a Boundary, page 35. The public school code was a central component of the education provided to successive generations of students at the August Queen's Royal College. Opened in 1870 and moved to its present location in 1904, the main college building is one of several formidable structures situated on the northwestern side of the 200-acre Queen's Park Savannah, straddling the northern edges of Port of Spain. The college's expatriated, quote, masters, educated at Oxford and Cambridge, instructed students in such subjects as Latin, Greek, French, geography, ancient history, mathematics, and literature. James was one of 39 pupils to enter Queen's Royal College in January 1911. The school year ran from January to December, and he graduated with a, quote, school certificate, end quote, in 1918. Footnote, as I learned during my visit to Queen's Royal College in 1992, James was enrolled by his father under the name Lionel James as an Anglican. End footnote. At first, James's, quote, marks, or grades, placed James at the very top of the class, but they slowly deteriorated as sports and reading took precedence over his studies. Footnote, in his first year, his scores were the following: English 91, Geography 83, English History 83, Diction 49 out of 50, Arithmetic 91, French 75, Latin 85. His grades in 1917 were lower: Essay 35 out of 50, Story 36 out of 40, Precis Writing 31 out of 50, Books 40 out of 60, History 74 of 100, Latin Unprepared 53 out of 100, Latin Sentences and Prose 56 out of 100, French Unprepared 69 out of 80, French Diction 14 out of 20, French Composition and Story 16 out of 100, French Oral 21 out of 30, Arithmetic 20 out of 100, Algebra 97 out of 150, Geometry 143 out of 150. End footnote. The school records indicate that his French was better than his Latin and that he showed promise in the field of mathematics. Footnote. His marks in 1917 were still high enough to place him in the top one-third of his class, and despite his status as a dedicated underachiever, he was the, quote, proximate accessist for the school's General Knowledge Prize in 1918. End footnote. Despite his disappointing academic performance, he later insisted that his, quote, scholastic career was one long nightmare to me, my teachers, and my family, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. James secured teaching positions at a succession of secondary schools, including Queen's Royal College. Upon graduation, footnote, prior to working at Queen's Royal College, James taught at Pamphylia High School, the government training college for teachers, where his father had received his teaching certificate, and at the Trinidad New College. See Carlton Coma's edited volume, Who's Who in Trinidad and Tobago, 1972 to 1973. End footnote. Quote, I was teaching practically after I left college, end quote. James later remembered, quote, I found it rather exhausting, but I couldn't leave it alone. After a time, they paid me well, end quote. James. Footnote, see Bull, The Making of a Literary Life in Henry and Bull's edited volumes, CLR James's Caribbean. End footnote. During the 1920s, James also taught students on an individual basis. One of his pupils was Eric Williams, who became the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Williams prepared for his Oxbridge entrance exams under James' tutelage. Footnote: whether James himself ever considered applying to Oxford or Cambridge remains unclear. James certainly never expressed any regret about not having attended university. In the end, James only left Port of Spain after two important preconditions were fulfilled. A, he had an invitation and a place to stay with the cricketer Leary Constantine, and B, he had a proven track record as a writer and essayist. In one interview, he stated that, quote, everybody knew that if I had worked at it, I would have won a scholarship and gone away to England, end quote. See Bull, The Making of a Literary Life, in Henry and Bull's edited volume, CLR James's Caribbean, page 58. Wikipedia says Eric Eustace Williams lived from 1911 to 1981 and was a Trinidad and Tobago politician. Eric Williams has been described as the, quote, father of the nation, having led the then British colony of Trinidad and Tobago to majority rule on the 28th of October 1956, to independence on the 31st of August 1962, and Republican status on the 1st of August 1976, leading an unbroken string of general elections victories with his political party, the People's National Movement, until his death in 1981. He was the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, and also a Caribbean historian, most noted for his book entitled Capitalism and Slavery. Back to the text. The public school code was also internalized through the norms of cricket and the refined sensibility imbricated in the French and English novels that he read as a child. Beyond a Boundary opens with a, quote, small boy of 6, end quote, standing on a bedroom chair to observe the cricket matches on the pitch below. From this chair, the child was able to, quote, stretch a groping hand for the books on the top of the wardrobe, end quote. As James has it, quote, thus the pattern of my life was set, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. Apart from family and school, cricket and books were very formative influences at work on the aspiring intellectual. James's enthusiasm for Thackeray was matched only by his ardor for the delicate rhythms of the cricket pitch. It would seem as if all aspects of his educational, family, and social background was aimed at imparting gentlemanly and scholarly values. Cricket played a Janus-faced role in James's moral development. The colonial authorities had introduced organized games in an effort to instill a temperate style of sportsmanship in a potentially disrespectful population. With its elaborate rules, distinctive costume, and parlor room etiquette, cricket seemed particularly well suited to the task of, quote, civilizing the restless and the discontented. In the hands of West Indians, however, cricket effectively became, quote, an opportunity for the West Indian to beat the master at his own game. At his own beautiful game, end quote. Footnote, see Helen Tiffin, Cricket Literature and the Politics of Decolonization, The Case of C.L.R. James, published in Richard Cashman and Michael McKernan's edited volume Sport, Money, Morality, and Media, published in Kensington, Australia, New South Wales Press, 1981. The description for this book just says, selection from papers delivered at the Second National Conference on Sports History held at the University of New South Wales in June 1979. Back to the text and footnote. By organizing teams and leagues that brought players from different islands into close contact, West Indians acquired skills that would later prove useful in the political realm. Inadvertently, then, cricket became an occasion for regional self-expression and self-organization. William Carr tells us, quote, "Cricket is not a game in the West Indies, or not merely a game, is the means whereby the colonial showed his human equivalence to the colonizer." End quote. William Carr. Footnote. William Carr, West Indian writing, with University Radio Service Mimeo, Kingston, Jamaica. End footnote. The eminent novelist V.S. Naipaul, Naipaul, who attended Queen's Royal College many years after James, provocatively suggested that cricket filled a major void in the West Indian experience, quote, "in islands that had known only brutality and greed," end quote. Naipaul writes, quote, "Cricket and its code provide an area of rest, a release for much that was denied by the society. Skill, courage, style, the graces, the very things that in a changed world are making the game archaic," end quote. Wikipedia says, V.S. Naipaul lived from 1932 to 2018. V.S. Naipaul was a Trinidadian-born British writer of works of fiction and non-fiction in English. V.S. Naipaul is known for his comic early novels set in Trinidad, Naipaul's bleaker novels of alienation in the wider world, and his vigilant chronicles of life and travels. V.S. Naipaul wrote in prose that was widely admired, but his views sometimes aroused controversy. He published more than 30 books over 50 years. Naipaul's breakthrough novel, A House for Miss Biswas, was published in 1961. Naipaul won the Booker Prize in 1971 for his novel, In a Free State. Naipaul won the Jerusalem Prize in 1983, and in 1990 he was awarded the Trinity Cross, Trinidad and Tobago's highest national honor. V.S. Naipaul received a knighthood in Britain in 1990 and the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2001. Back to the text and footnote. On the pitch, James came into contact with men such as Matthew Bondman, learned to play cricket by watching them, and became familiar with their plebeian habits. Not saying anything on Matthew Bondman. James later remarked that he had played cricket, quote, uninterruptedly, from the age of 4 to the age of 31. Footnote. C.L.R. James article, Return of a Wanderer, Comparisons Between 1938 and 1953, published in 1953 and republished in James, Cricket. The description of this book on Goodreads says, James is beautifully exact in his description of cricket technique and unique in his capacity to relate it both to individual personalities and to historical tendencies. No ordinary sports writer. Cricket is much more than a game to James. It's a way of life. perfect for anyone wanting to understand the love of the game of cricket. Back to the text and footnote. Exposure to the practices of cricket expanded his social horizons and provided him with material for his lively anthropological curiosity. Literature also played a steady and complex role in his personal development. Reading and efforts at journalism offered tools for autonomous intellectual achievement. In James's early 20s, James began to nurture a pronounced dissatisfaction with the restrictions placed on an educated black man in colonial society. This discontent was to gestate slowly, but the roots of James's anti-colonialism and radicalism are to be found in his formative personal experiences on the playing fields and as a reader of literature, history, and biography. As a student, James was placed in a contradictory social position. The public school code, his parents' moral teachings, and his scholastic training were valorized in the midst of a colonial setting. The code stressed fair play, and yet British rule was manifestly unjust. His family wanted their eldest son to establish himself within the pre-existing political and judicial institutions, and yet a range of dissenting beliefs were discussed at home. Queen's Royal College taught the history and culture of societies many thousands of miles away. These contradictions helped to foster a certain kind of rebelliousness and self-consciousness in the mind of an observant and confident Trinidadian youth. An expression of these contradictions was the fact that as a young man, James read the Times literary supplement, The Spectator, and the highbrow weeklies, but also purchased Negro World, the newspaper of the Jamaican-born black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey, quote, every Saturday morning down St. Vincent Street in Port of Spain, end quote. James, from the article on the origins. I'm just going to read brush up on my Marcus Garvey knowledge. Marcus Mosiah Garvey Jr. lived from 1887 to 1940 and was a Jamaican political activist. Marcus Garvey was the founder and first President General of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, UNIA-ACL, commonly known as UNIA, through which Garvey declared himself Provisional President of Africa. Garvey was ideologically a black nationalist and Pan-Africanist. Garvey's ideas came to be known as Garveyism. Garvey was born into a moderately prosperous Afro-Jamaican family in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica, and was apprenticed in the print trade as a teenager. Working in Kingston, Garvey got involved in trade unionism before living briefly in Costa Rica, Panama, and England. On returning to Jamaica, Marcus Garvey founded the UNIA in 1914. In 1916, Garvey moved to the United States and established a UNIA branch in New York City's Harlem district. Emphasizing unity between Africans and the African diaspora, Garvey campaigned for an end to European colonial rule in Africa and advocated the political unification of the continent. He envisioned a unified Africa as a one-party state, governed by himself, that would enact laws to ensure black racial purity. Although Garvey never visited the continent, he was committed to the Back to Africa movement, arguing that part of the diaspora should migrate there. Isn't that kind of a ridiculous idea? Would they say that he declared himself Provisional President of Africa and never went to Africa? Although Garvey never visited the continent, Garvey was committed to the Back to Africa movement, arguing that part of the diaspora should migrate there. Garvey's ideas became increasingly popular, and the UNIA grew in membership. Garvey's black separatist views and his relationship with white racists like the KKK in the interest of advancing their shared goal of racial separatism, caused a division between Garvey and other prominent African American civil rights activists, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who promoted racial integration. Racial integration. Believing that black people needed to be financially independent from white-dominated societies, Garvey launched various businesses in the U.S., including the Negro Factories Corporation and Negro World newspaper. In 1919, Garvey became president of the Black Star Line Shipping and Passenger Company, designed to forge a link between North America and Africa and facilitate African American migration to Liberia. In 1920, Garvey was convicted of mail fraud for selling the company's stock, and he was imprisoned in the United States Penitentiary, Atlanta, for nearly 2 years. Many commentators have argued that the trial was politically motivated. Garvey blamed Jewish people, claiming that Jewish people were prejudiced against Garvey because of his links to the KKK, as if that would be illegitimate if that was true. After his sentence was commuted by U.S. President Calvin Coolidge, Garvey was deported to Jamaica in 1927, settling in Kingston with his wife Amy Jacques. Garvey established the People's Political Party in 1929. Briefly serving as city councilor. With the UNIA in increasing financial difficulty, Garvey relocated to London in 1935, where Garvey's anti-socialist stance distanced Garvey from many of the city's black activists. Garvey died in London in 1940, and in 1964 Garvey's body was returned to Jamaica for reburial in Kingston's National Heroes Park. Garvey was a controversial figure. Some in the African diaspora community regarded Garvey as a pretentious demagogue, and they were highly critical of his collaboration with white supremacists, Garvey's violent rhetoric, and his prejudice against mixed-race people and Jews. Garvey received praise for encouraging a sense of pride and self-worth among Africans in the African diaspora amid widespread poverty, discrimination, and colonialism. In Jamaica, Garvey is recognized as a national hero, being the first to be recognized as such. Marcus Garvey's ideas exerted a considerable influence on such movements as Rastafari, the Nation of Islam, and the Black Power movement. Back to the text and footnote. Garvey, the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, I'm looking up. Garvey, the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, who championed the cause of Pan-African pride, attracted thousands of followers across the globe, calling for a mass exodus, quote, back to Africa. Wikipedia says the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, UNIA-ACL, is a black nationalist fraternal organization founded by Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican immigrant to the United States, and his then wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey. The African nationalist organization enjoyed its greatest strength in the 1920s and was influential prior to Garvey's deportation to Jamaica in 1927. After that, its prestige and influence declined, but it had a strong influence on African American history and development. The UNIA was said to be, quote, unquestionably the most influential anti-colonial organization in Jamaica prior to 1938, end quote, according to Honor Ford Smith. The Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Committees League was founded to work for the advancement of people of African ancestry around the world. The UNIA ACL's motto is One God, One Aim, One Destiny, and its slogan is Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad. The broad mission of the UNIA ACL led to the establishment of numerous auxiliary components, among them the African Legion, a paramilitary group, the African Black Cross Nurses, plus businesses such as the Black Star Steamship Line and the Negro Factories Corporation. And Wikipedia says the Back to Africa movement was a political movement in the 19th and 20th centuries, advocating for a return of the descendants of African American slaves to the African continent. The movement originated from a widespread belief among some European Americans in the 18th and 19th century United States that African Americans would want to return to the continent of Africa. Bracket citation needed, end bracket. In general, the political movement was an overwhelming failure. Very few former slaves wanted to move to Africa. The small number of freed slaves who did settle in Africa, some under duress, initially faced brutal conditions due to diseases to which they no longer had biological resistance. As the failure became known in the United States in the 1820s, it spawned and energized the radical abolitionist movement. In the 20th century, the Jamaican political activist and black nationalist Marcus Garvey, members of the Rastafari movement, and other African Americans supported the concept, but few actually left the United States. In the late 18th century, thousands of black loyalists joined British military forces during the American Revolutionary War. In 1787, the British Crown founded a settlement in Sierra Leone in what was called the, quote, Province of Freedom, beginning a long process of settlement of formerly enslaved African Americans in Sierra Leone. During these same years, some African Americans launched their own initiative to return to Africa, and by 1811, Paul Cuffey, a wealthy New England African American / Native American shipper, had transported some members of the group known as the, quote, Free African Society, end quote, to Liberia. During these years, some free African Americans also relocated to Haiti, where a slave revolution had effected a free black state by 1800. On the 18th of November 1803, Haiti became the first ever nation to successfully gain independence through a slave revolt. In the following years, Liberia was founded by free Africans from the United States. The emigration of African Americans, both free and recently emancipated, was funded and organized by the American Colonization Society, ACS, which hoped that slavery could be ended as an institution without releasing millions of former slaves into American society. The mortality rate of these settlers was high. Of the 4,571 emigrants who arrived in Liberia between 1820 and 1843, only 1,819 survived. So, back to the text. Thank you for that detour. The multiple tensions driven by the conflict between the mores of the public school code and daily life under colonial rule gave James an ambiguous perspective on the relations of race and class. Although James's parents disapproved of calypso music, their eldest son was, quote, fascinated by the calypso singers and the sometimes ribald ditties they sang in their tents during carnival time, end quote. Footnote, James, Beyond a Boundary, page 25. One gains the impression that James watched everyday life from a distance. James's growing awareness of social issues seems not to have been matched by any specifically racial consciousness. Quote, in our little Eden, end quote, James wrote of Queen's Royal College, racial discrimination, quote, never troubled us, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary, page 39. In unfinished notes for his autobiography, James goes so far as to say that, quote, for many years the race question did not seem to exist in the college at all, end quote. James describes studying and joking with two boys in particular, Ulrich and Hahn, both scions of prominent white families. The friends spent considerable time marking out their own private space. Quote, we were concerned, end quote, James writes, quote, that we would be able to read privately while the master was holding forth on French composition or algebraic equations, ... The three of us happened to like each other, and particularly the books we used to read, and most enjoyably during class hours, end quote. James. Footnote, untitled and undated autobiographical note housed at the archive of the Oil Workers Trade Union, San Fernando. End footnote. Although the environment of Queen's Royal College allowed for various kinds of social interaction, black students were nevertheless subject to official forms of discrimination. And Beyond a Boundary, James discusses being denied admission on racial grounds into the local English regiment near the end of World War I, yet James insists that this incident left no scars on his psyche. The historian John Laguerre pointedly suggests that James's isolation from more virulent strains of racial prejudice, quote, gave rise to a, quote, detachment on racial questions that was rare for a Negro intellectual of his time, ... end quote. Laguerre goes on to suggest that this sense of detachment was, quote, destined to be one of the outstanding characteristics of James's entire career as a political thinker, end quote. Footnote, John Gayford Laguerre, The Social and Political Thought of the Colonial Intelligentsia. Published in Kingston, Jamaica, Institute of Social and Economic Research, 1982. Back to the text. End footnote. The, quote, real world, however, did touch James's life beyond modest interactions on the cricket pitch and snatched portions of Calypso. Calypso songs. Excuse me. In the winter of 1919 to 1920, a strike by dock workers in Port of Spain turned into a, quote, series of violent challenges against British colonialism, end quote. Footnote, see the article by Tony Martin, Revolutionary Upheaval in Trinidad, 1919, Journal of Negro History, July 1973, page 313. End footnote. Other unions joined the dock workers and disrupted urban life with mass pickets and stormy public meetings. Returning veterans proved especially eager to join labor organizations and participate in strike activity. Within a couple of weeks, strikers in several industries were granted 25% across the board wage increases. The authorities blamed the Garveyites and their Negro world for the unrest, but the, quote, major cause of this wave of strikes was undoubtedly rampant inflation and worsening economic conditions, end quote, with, quote, racial feeling playing an important role in heightening tensions, ... end quote. Footnote, see Bray-Retton, A History of Modern Trinidad, page 161. Not seeing any descriptions for that book. And footnote. I wanted to look up Negro World. It's been mentioned a couple times now. Wikipedia says Negro World was (when?) and the newspaper of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. Founded by Garvey and Amy Ashwood Garvey, the newspaper was published weekly in Harlem and distributed internationally to the Universal Negro Improvement Association's chapters in more than 40 countries. Distributed weekly at Negro World's peak, the Negro World reached a circulation of 200,000. Notable editors included Marcus Garvey, T. Thomas Fortune, William H. Ferris, W. A. Domingo, and Amy Jacques Garvey. Back to the text. Through a fellow cricketer, James, quote, knew some of the men who were leading it, and I am positive that they were Garveyites, ... All I did was to go and watch what was happening without taking any part, end quote. Footnote. C.L.R. James interviewed by Alan Mackenzie, October 1975. End footnote. Despite these dramatic episodes of labor unrest, James remained more interested in athletics than political ideology. Footnote. James was similarly less than preoccupied with the opposite sex. In my experience with women, James remembered being, quote, more concerned with reading, with cricket, and other activities of the kind, and I don't know that sex occupied a very important part of my life, end quote. James. End footnote. Margaret Busby reports that James held Trinidad's high jump record, 5 foot 9 inches, from 1918 to 1922. Footnote. See Margaret Busby. Busby, I was saying it wrong. Margaret Busby's article, C.L.R. James, a biographical introduction, in C.L.R. James's At the Rendezvous of Victory Selected Writings. Published in London by Allison and Busby, 1984. And At the Rendezvous of History is available at Libcom. I'm trying to find a decent description of it. According to Libcom, it says, this was the third and final in a series of anthologies published during James's lifetime by publishers Allison and Busby, following The Future and the Present, published in 1977, and Spheres of Existence, published in 1980. Back to the text and footnote. At Queen's Royal College, James' best jump had been 5 foot 5 inches, which earned him a place in the school's record books. James also played cricket for Queen's Royal College and was listed as one of the school's best bowlers from 1917 and 1918. For 1917 and 1918. Throughout the 1920s, James batted and bowled for the Maple team, a club based in Port of Spain. A passage in Beyond a Boundary describes how the cricket club symbolically represented different social groups on the island. The Queen's Park Club was for the white and well-to-do. At the other end of the scale was Stingo, the club for black laborers and the long-term unemployed. James faced something of an identity crisis when he had to choose between Maple, which was for brown-skinned players of the middle strata, and Shannon for lower middle-class blacks. Quote, faced with the fundamental division in the island, I had gone to the right and by cutting myself off from the popular side, delayed my political development for years, end quote. James, beyond a boundary. Apart from athletics, literature was his other main concern after graduation. Alfred Mendes, a leading participant in Trinidadian literary circles and a wealthy confederate of James's, later identified World War I and the Russian Revolution as major factors motivating West Indian intellectuals and writers of the 1920s and 1930s, although both events are given short shrift in Beyond a Boundary. According to Wikipedia, Alfred Mendes lived from 1897 to 1991 and was a Trinidadian and Tobagonian novelist and short story writer. Alfred Mendes was a leading member of the 1930s Beacon group of writers, named after the literary magazine The Beacon, in Trinidad and Tobago, which included Albert Gomez, C.L.R. James, and Ralph de Boissiere. Alfred Mendes is best known as the author of two novels, Pitch Lake from 1934 and Black Fawns 1935, and for Alfred Mendes's short stories written during the 1920s and 1930s. Alfred Mendes was, quote, one of the first West Indian writers to set the pattern of emigration in the face of the lack of publishing houses and the small reading public in the West Indies, end quote. Alfred Mendes's experiences in World War I were the inspiration for the 2019 film 1917, written and directed by his grandson, Sam Mendes. Back to the text. An expanding black middle class and increased social and commercial contact with the world beyond the Caribbean led to the formation of literary circles and the publication of West Indian journals of commentary and review. In addition to his obligations in the spheres of teaching and cricket, James belonged to a literary club, the Maverick, and participated in amateur dramatics. Footnote: at the age of 21, James directed an operetta, Gypsy Rover, and played a jester. At the age of 28, James directed Molière's Les Bourgeois Gentilhommes for the Maverick Club. End footnote. In the late 1920s, Mendes and James produced 2 issues of a journal, Trinidad, and both men contributed essays and short fiction to The Beacon, published between 1931 and 1933, which was edited by the seditious-minded Portuguese Creole Albert Gomez. Albert Gomez, Trinidad. Wikipedia says Albert Maria Gomez lived from 1911 to 1978. Albert Gomez was a Trinidadian unionist, politician, and writer of Portuguese descent, was the first chief minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Albert Gomez was the founder of the Political Progress Groups and later led the Party of Political Progress Groups. Albert Gomez was active in the formation of the Democratic Labour Party in Trinidad and Tobago and played a role in forcing Sir Alexander Bustamante out of the Federal Democratic Labour Party. Gomez briefly led the Democratic Labour Party in 1963 when factions loyal to briefly ousted Ruud Renat Capildeo after Capildeo left Trinidad and Tobago to take up a position at the University of London. However, the rank and file of the party stood behind Capildeo and Gomez left the party. Back to the text. Later in the 1940s and 1950s, a right-leaning Gomez helped negotiate the terms of political self-representation prior to the period of independence. James's first literary success came in 1927 with the publication of La Divina Pastora in the Sunday Evening Review. Footnote: James's local reputation was enhanced when La Divina Pastora was selected for the Best British Short Stories of 1928 with an Irish and colonial supplement edited by Edward J. O'Brien. End footnote. By the middle of the 1920s, writing had become the central focus of James's activities. Teaching and tutoring were enjoyable day jobs, nothing more and nothing less, and while he was a competent bowler, he was unlikely to become a top-ranked professional cricketer like his friend Leary Constantine. Wikipedia says Leary Constantine lived from 1901 to 1971. Leary Constantine was a Trinidadian cricketer, lawyer, and politician who served as Trinidad and Tobago's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom and became the UK's first black peer. Leary Constantine played 18 Test matches for the West Indies before the Second World War and took the team's first wicket in Test cricket. An advocate against racial discrimination in later life, he was influential in passing of the 1965 Race Relations Act in Britain. Leary Constantine was knighted in 1962 and made a life peer in 1969. Born in Trinidad, Leary Constantine established an early reputation as a promising cricketer and was a member of the West Indies teams that toured England in 1923 and 1928. Unhappy at the lack of opportunities for black people in Trinidad, Leary Constantine decided to pursue a career as a professional cricketer in England, and during the 1928 tour was awarded a contract with the Lancashire League club Nelson. Leary Constantine played for the club with distinction between 1929 and 1938, while continuing as a member of the West Indies Test team and tours of England and Australia. Although his record as a Test cricketer was less impressive than in other cricket, he helped to establish a uniquely West Indian style of play. Leary Constantine was chosen as one of the Wisden Cricketers of the year 1939. During the Second World War, Constantine worked for the Ministry of Labor and National Service as a welfare officer responsible for West Indians employed in English factories. In 1943, the manager of a London hotel refused to accommodate Constantine and his family on the grounds of their race in an instance of the UK colour bar. Constantine successfully sued the hotel company. Commentators recognized the case as a milestone in British racial equality. Leary Constantine qualified as a barrister in 1954, while also establishing himself as a journalist and broadcaster. Leary Constantine returned to Trinidad and Tobago in 1954, entered politics and became a founding member of the People's National Movement, subsequently entering the government as Minister of Communications. From 1961 to 1964, Leary Constantine served as head commissioner to the United Kingdom and controversially became involved in issues relating to racial discrimination, including the Bristol bus boycott. In Leary Constantine's final years, he served on the Race Relations Board, the Sports Council, and the Board of Governors of the BBC. Failing health reduced Leary Constantine's effectiveness in some of these roles, and he faced criticism for becoming a part of the British establishment. Constantine Leary died of a heart attack on the 1st of July 1971, age 69. In June 2021, Leary Constantine was inducted into the ICC Cricket Hall of Fame as one of the special inductees to mark the inaugural edition of the ICC World Test Championship final. Back to the text. By way of contrast, writing brought James virtually instant acclaim. It was the natural accompaniment to his former pastime, reading, and it held out the promise of freedom and independence. James became used to writing in his apartment for long periods of the day, mostly in longhand on legal-sized pads. His script was firm but often jerky, as if he were in a rush. Later on, James suffered painful cramps in his hand and stomach and had to carefully husband his energies. But his commitment to the discipline of writing on a daily basis on a range of topics remained unflagged. La Divina Pastora tells the story of Anita, a woman from North Trace who picks cocoa from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. for 30 cents a day. Hard-working Anita quietly prays for marriage to a gentlemanly farmer of her acquaintance. Anita visits Siparia, the South Trinidad pilgrim site of La Divina Pastora, to enlist the help of the saint, leaving a gold chain around the neck of the statue. Lo and behold, the pilgrimage is successful and the farmer asks Anita to a local dance. Following the dance, Anita returns home, happily singing to herself. When she arrives, she faints after finding the gold chain back in its cigarette tin. The story itself is unremarkable, except that it conveys a sympathetic interest in belief structures and religious practices of the working poor. Its unadorned prose tells us about a humble woman without resorting to sentimental flourishes or condescending asides. James's fiction for Trinidad, I guess the journal, is of the same type. Quote, the fiction, I guess the piece Triumph, focuses more directly on the infamous Trinidadian barracks yards or slums. In Triumph, the same elements of poverty, just rewards, and the plight of ordinary women are present. A depressed Mammoth works overtime trying to secure steady lovers who will pay her rent and her bills. She is not amoral, but nevertheless, quote, saw to it when she moved that you missed none of her charms, end quote. Footnote. C.L.R. James, Triumph, reprinted in C.L.R. James, The Future in the Present, Selected Writings. This is also available at LibCom, and the description for it says, first in a series of out-of-print anthologies by C.L.R. James. Back to the text. Mammoth is popular with all of her neighbors except Irene, a religious woman who disapproves of Mammoth's amorous relations. Irene tries to set Mammoth up for a fall, but revenge is pure and sweet for Mammoth, who triumphs in the end, to a greater extent than either La Divina Pastora or the story Turner's Prosperity, which also ran in Trinidad. Triumph relies on sexual and violent situations to provide sociological insights into barrack yard behavior. Women are routinely beaten, sex is traded for cash, and only a thin veneer of humor lightens scenes that are fraught with physical conflict. At one point, a wronged lover, Nicholas, wearing his bloody butcher's apron, quote, bloody butcher's apron, end quote, holds Mammoth tightly by the throat and says, I will stick my knife into you as I will stick it in a cow. You had Popo des Vignes in that room for the whole day. Speak the truth, you dog. And you, mother, your sister, your aunt, your wife, was the dog, end quote, shrieked Mammoth, quoting one of Celestine's most brilliant pieces of repartee. Sorry, the weird accent that I did there is reflecting the way the words are spelled. The beacon, which improbably billed itself as a, quote, guiding light for all who are in intellectual darkness and who seek great things, end quote, expressed a more openly political tone than the magazine Trinidad. Albert Gomez, in particular, was highly critical of the colonial regime. As founder, publisher, and editor of The Beacon, Gomez called on the masses to rise up in revolt. Quote, black men bearded old son of a slave, your children are being slain by the dozens in America, in Africa, in the Indies, ... Bare your fangs as the white man does. Cast off your docility. You have to be a savage like a white man to escape the white man's. But the white man won't spare your neck. End quote. Footnote. Albert Gomez, The Beacon, cited in La Guerre, the social and political thought of the colonial intelligentsia. End footnote. Compared to that, James's comments in The Beacon's following issue should have reassured at least a few readers. Quote, I am not touchous, sick, on the race question. If at times I feel some bitterness at the disabilities and disadvantages to which my being a Negro has subjected me, it is soon washed away by remembering that the few things in my life of which I am proud I owe, apart from my family, chiefly to white men, almost all Englishmen and Americans, men, some of them of international reputation, who have shown me kindness, appreciation, and in more than one case, spontaneous and genuine friendship. End quote. James. Indeed, virtually all of James's essays for the Beacon were characterized by their moderate tone. One piece, which ran under the heading Books and Writers, commended the work of Victorian author Arnold Bennett, while another addressed, quote, the problem of knowledge, and warmly spoke of Trinidad's, quote, bookshops, music stores, newspapers, and conversations, end quote. Footnote, C.L.R. James, The Problem of Knowledge, published in The Beacon, March 1931. Wikipedia says Arnold Bennett lived from 1867 to 1931. Arnold Bennett was an English author, best known as a novelist who wrote prolifically. Between the 1890s and 1930s, Enoch Bennett completed 34 novels, 7 volumes of short stories, 13 plays, some in collaboration with other writers, and a daily journal totaling more than 1 million words. Enoch Bennett wrote articles and stories for more than 100 newspapers and periodicals, worked in and briefly ran the Ministry of Information during the First World War, and wrote for the cinema in the 1920s. Sales of Bennett's books were substantial, and Bennett was the most financially successful British author of his day. Born in a modest but upwardly mobile family in Hanley, in the Staffordshire Potteries, Arnold Bennett was intended by his father, a solicitor, to follow him into the legal profession. Bennett worked for his father before moving to another law firm in London as a clerk at the age of 21. He became assistant editor and then editor of a women's magazine before becoming a full-time author in 1900. Always a devotee of French culture in general and French literature in particular, Arnold Bennett moved to Paris in 1903. In Paris, the relaxed milieu helped Arnold Bennett overcome his intense shyness, particularly with women. Arnold Bennett spent 10 years in France, marrying a French woman in 1907. In 1912, Arnold Bennett moved back to England. Arnold Bennett and his wife separated in 1921, and Arnold Bennett spent the last years of his life with a new partner, an English actress. Arnold Bennett died in 1931 of typhoid fever, having unwisely drunk tap water in France. Many of Arnold Bennett's novels and short stories are set in a fictionalized version of the Staffordshire Potteries, which Arnold Bennett called the Five Towns. Arnold Bennett strongly believed that literature should be accessible to ordinary people, and Arnold Bennett deplored literary cliques and elites. Arnold Bennett's books appealed to a wide public and sold in large numbers. For this reason, and for Arnold Bennett's adherence to realism, Writers and supporters of the modernist school, notably Virginia Woolf, belittled Arnold Bennett, and his fiction became neglected after Arnold Bennett's death. During Arnold Bennett's lifetime, Arnold Bennett's journalistic, quote, self-help books sold in substantial numbers, and Arnold Bennett was also a playwright. He did less well in the theater than with novels, but achieved two considerable successes with Milestones of 1912 and The Great Adventure, 1913. Studies by Margaret Drabble, 1974, John Carey, 1992, and others have led to a reevaluation of Arnold Bennett's work. The finest of Arnold Bennett's novels, including Anna of the Five Towns, published in 1902, The Old Wives' Tale, published in 1908, Clayhanger, published in 1910, and Ricey Man's Steps, 1923, are now widely recognized as major works. End footnote. At the same time, back to the text, at the same time, James initiated a fierce debate over the comparative intelligence of the races in an article on the intelligence of the Negro, a few words with Dr. Harland, which generated a number of responses throughout the second half of 1931. In addition, traced the intellectual roots of black nationalism in an informative piece on the 19th century lawyer and social critic Michel Maxwell Phillip. Footnote. See C.L.R. James, Michel Maxwell Phillip, 1829 to 1886, sometimes Solicitor General of Trinidad and Impression, published in the Beacon, September 1931. See Selwyn Cudjoe's article, The Audacity of It All, C.L.R. James's Trinidadian Background, in Henry and Boole's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Caribbean, pages 39 to 55. End footnote. Let's look up Michel Maxwell Phillip. According to Wikipedia, Michel Maxwell Phillip lived from 1829 to 1888. Michel Maxwell Phillip was a Trinidadian novelist, lawyer, and civil servant. Back to the text. Despite the fact that the, quote, policy of the magazine was really the absence of a policy, end quote, the reading public focused on Albert Gomez's outrageous brand of militant rhetoric, and the Beacon faced libel threats, police harassment, and vitriolic attacks from church pulpits. The Beacon's concern for the plight of the poor, the Beacon's sometimes explicit, quote, local nationalism, end quote, earned the journal an unflattering editorial in the island's newspaper of record, the Trinidad Guardian. Quote, letters protesting against the obscenities of the magazine have been pouring into the Guardian office during the past week. One is from a Boy Scout who says, quote, its disagreeable implications cast unwarrantable aspersions on the fair name of our beautiful island, end quote. Footnote. Well, there's a couple footnotes, actually. Albert Gomez, Through a Maze of Color, Port of Spain, Key Caribbean Publications, published in 1974. I'm not seeing any descriptions for that book. And footnote. Footnote. This phrase is taken from John Gaffar Laguerre, The Politics of Communalism, The Agony of the Left in Trinidad and Tobago, 1930 to 1955, published in 1982. I don't believe I'm seeing any descriptions for this book. I'm not seeing anything for that book. And footnote. Footnote cited in Kenneth Ramshawn's Introduction to Minty Valley, 1936, published in London by New Beacon Books, or republished in London, New Beacon Books, 1971. End footnote. The circle around Gomez and Mendez thrived on controversy, with Gomez later remembering that they, quote, were held together by a common bond of detestation of the hypocrisy, obscurantism, and general claustrophobia of Trinidadian society, ... End quote. Gomez through a maze of color. Footnote. Gomez through a maze of color, end footnote. Certainly, the brouhaha surrounding the Beacon's more controversial editorials was unlikely to have impeded James's career. During the 1920s, James was clearly a, quote, young man with a future, end quote, a budding writer with good personal connections, a mostly supportive family, and a cozy niche in Trinidad's emergent literary subculture. A biographical note in the Beacon described James as a fiction writer who, quote, has had some success, but is tired of hearing them said over and over again. End quote. Footnote. The Beacon, Volume 1, Number 1, March 1931. James goes on to say, quote, so will not mention them, married, nothing else of importance, end quote. As an advocate of modernist ideas in the spheres of literature and criticism, James was also something of a bohemian with a mild disdain for social convention. For several years, James lived in the Belmont section of Port of Spain, where James wrote, entertained friends, and listened to records. An acquaintance from this period remembered James's room as being, quote, simply appointed, a table, a large orthophonic cabinet record player, and a bed placed diagonally across the room, on which were always two open books, end quote. Footnote. MacDonald Celestin Taylor. MacDonald Celestin Taylor. This article, C.L.R. James, a most talented and remarkable man, published in the Sunday Express, April 25th, 1982. MacDonald Celestin Taylor reports that a local businessman, J.T. Johnson, offered to make James, quote, manager of the new musical department of the departmental store on Frederick Street, end quote, as a result of his expertise in the area of jazz and classical music. End footnote. It was during this jazz age period that James read all 6 volumes of Havelock Ellis's The Psychology of Sex, which provided James with a, quote, scientific understanding of sex and sexual relations. Footnote. In the autobiographical essay titled My Experience with Women, James explained that, quote, there were not too many books in my life that meant too much to me at that time. That one did, and I felt at the time that I knew all there was to be known about sex. What I know was that it gave me an attitude to sex which was, the best word that I can use is scientific. It was something that took place and people reacted to it in various ways, and some were normal and some were what you might call abnormal, end quote. C.L.R. James. End footnote. Wikipedia says Havelock Ellis lived from 1859 to 1939 and was an English physician, eugenicist, writer, progressive intellectual, and social reformer who studied human sexuality. Havelock Ellis co-wrote the first medical textbook in English on homosexuality in 1897 and also published works on a variety of sexual practices and inclinations, as well as on transgender psychology. Havelock Ellis developed the notions of narcissism and autoeroticism, later adopted by psychoanalysis. Havelock Ellis was among the pioneering investigators of psychedelic drugs and the author of the first written reports to the public about an experience with mescaline, which Havelock Ellis conducted on himself in 1896. Havelock Ellis supported eugenics and served as one of 16 vice presidents of the Eugenics Society from 1909 to 1912. Back to the text. Havelock Ellis, Psychology of Sex. Not seeing any very good descriptions of this book. I'm reading something. Hold on. Originally published in London 1933, a concise introduction to sexual psychology, primarily intended for medical readers and students, but also aimed at a wider audience with its expert guidance and advice on numerous sexual topics. Contents include biology of sex, sexual impulse in youth, sexual deviation, erotic symbolisms, homosexuality, marriage, the art of love, etc. Many of the earliest books, particularly those dating back to the 1900s and before, are now extremely scarce and increasingly expensive. Home Farm Books are republishing these classic works in affordable, high-quality modern editions using the original text and artwork. So, back to the text. Standing at 6'3" tall, versed in the canon of Western civilization, the young CLR was an avid consumer of records and books who spent a great deal of time walking and discoursing on the cosmopolitan streets of Port of Spain. An athlete and an aesthete, James was perhaps more socially aware than many of his associates, but less politically awakened than others. Like others in his sophisticated circle, he no doubt found the prevalent system of government flawed and archaic, and James was quite aware of the limitations that colonial society placed on young men such as himself. But James apparently did not go so far as to call for national independence, and in no way was James a socialist. James's main energies were concentrated on teaching, writing fiction, and playing cricket, although James later recalled that, quote, the real magnum opus, end quote, of his Trinidadian literary career was to be a second novel, a novel that was never written. Footnote: James Beyond a Boundary, page 119. James told Paul Bull that the novel would have been about, quote, my school days, my father teaching me in the elementary school. Then I go to Queen's Royal College. Then I became a teacher in secondary schools, ... So it might seem to be my personal life, but in reality it would have been different stages of the form of existence of black people in the Caribbean. End quote. See Bull's article, The Making of a Literary Life, in Hendry and Bull's edited volume, CLR James's Caribbean. End footnote. James also dabbled in poetry. The one extant poem, titled Pascal Bold, memorably described a mythical encounter that pitted Leary Constantine's uncle, the bowler Victor Pascal, against the world's greatest cricket batsman. Footnote. And then there's the poem, which I'll try to read. Came Chabrol, Nurse, and C.R. Brown, men of great fame and tried renown, each to add luster to his name, and win his country lasting fame, but Pascal bold. Barbados brought a great array of batsmen who could stay all day. They had defense, could force the game, bowl fast or slow, 'twas all the same. But Pascal bold, bring Hendren, Hobbs, and DJ Knight, Jackie Hearn to bowl and J.C. White, and Brown of Hearts to keep the wicket. Let them all come, those kings of cricket. And bring Australians if you care. Whatever the team, we have no fear. But put Bardsley down in your selection. To Armstrong we have no objection. Just let Pascal bowl. And when to England back they reach, and tread the sands of Dover's beach, and people crowd around to know the reason for their wretched show, a tear will shine in Hendren's eye, Jack Hearn will heave a bitter sigh, and Hobbs will shake his head and cry, well, friends, we made a decent try, Armstrong and Bardsley, Hearn and I, but Pascal bold. C.L.R. James, Pascal bold. Reprinted in Leary Constantine, Cricket and I. And the description for the book Cricket and I by Leary Constantine says, early autobiography of Leary Constantine, who lived from 1901 to 1971, one of the greatest names in West Indies cricket. Against England in 1930, Constantine bowled West Indies to their first win in a test match. In 1933, he published his first book, Cricket and I, with the help of his friend C.L.R. James. Leary Constantine played a key role in West Indies winning the series against England in 1934 to 35. This book was first published in 1933. Back to the text and footnote. The one novel that did get composed was Minty Alley, written, quote, purely to amuse myself one summer, bracket 1928, and bracket, I had nothing to do in August and I wrote a chapter a day, end quote. James. Footnote. Ian Munro and Richard Sander, Cos, interviews the three Caribbean writers. Published Austin, Texas. African and Afro-American Research Institute, University of Texas, 1972. And I'm not seeing any good descriptions for that book. All it says is that the interviews are with George Lamming, C.L.R. James, and Wilson Harris. Back to the text and footnote. It narrates the fortunes of Mr. Haynes, a young bookstore clerk who moves into cheap lodgings at number 2 Minty Alley to see something of the world and experiment with life. Inevitably, Haynes, whose inquisitive yet bookish character was not so unlike that of the author's, is drawn into the life of the neighborhood. The other residents look up to Haynes on account of his status as a white-collar worker, and he tries to give advice that will minimize conflict in the alley. Haynes conveniently discovers a crack in his bedroom wall, which enables him to watch the nearby goings-on. His eavesdropping is richly symbolic of the author's own sense of distance from everyday life. As James can only describe from behind a wall of text the meaning of life for the urban poor, Haynes's spying is not meant to betray a superior attitude on the part of the youthful character. Indeed, Haynes becomes firmly impressed that the alley dwellers were far more interesting than the snobbish friends of his deceased parents. Haynes found himself sitting, quote, waiting to see the household set about its daily tasks. The stage, he felt, was set for a terrific human drama, end quote. Drama arrives as a passionate sexual affair erupts between Haynes and Macy, a spirited young woman. Haynes stops being the voyeur and becomes an active participant in his own life. The possibility is raised that the young lodger might in some way choose the lifestyle of Minty Alley, severing his ties to a more respectable past. But Haynes and the author is not ready for such a sharp rupture with conventional society. Macy runs off to America, a deep unhappiness settles in the yard, and the property is finally sold by the destitute landlady. Haynes returns to his own people. Even Minty Alley as a physical structure changes as gentrification upgrades the buildings in the yard, returning as Haynes does to their original status. The novel ends with the protagonist back where he started, a passive bystander. Quote, he stood outside, looking in at the window and thinking of old times, end quote. As in La Divina Pastora and Triumph, James explores the tempo and vernacular of the barrack yard. Although James doesn't identify the sources of Trinidadian poverty, James vividly depicts the affliction of material scarcity, and James carefully dissects the social and class divisions. The characters' dialects seem natural, and the tone is sympathetic without being maudlin. Haynes and a neighborhood man, Benoit, have a drink. Quote, I won't say the quote, but this is from the book. Well, how do you like your new life? Said Haynes. Not bad, but he avoided Haynes's eyes. Of course, we haven't settled down yet. The nurse out working and I have to fix up at home, you know. But we will move soon and get a servant. By the new year, you know. If there was money, he wasn't getting much of it. He had a cent in his pocket and let Haynes know as much. You have cigarettes? No, said Haynes, feeling his pocket. Benoit asked him to get some. Let's have another beer. Yes, man, liquor is helpful. And that's the end of the bit from the book. A little earlier, a resident gossip describes Benoit's wedding. And this is from the book, Minty Alley. Miss Atwell began. The church was full of people. A lot of idlers. I suppose they had come to see the Jezebel, bracket, Benoit's new wife, and bracket, married at last. 'Cause everybody know what she is, you know, Mr. Haynes. And people was only whispering about the way the snake come on to you house and take the man away. There was a strange woman next to me, and we was talking about it all the time. The bride was in white with a lot of beads, she continued, but although the cloth was expensive, she didn't look well. Miss Atwell shut her eyes, shook her head, and repeated, giving emphasis to each word, she didn't look well, and one foolish little hat on her head. And as for he, in the old grey suit, I looked to see what kind of shoes he had on. If was new ones in truth, but where I was sitting I couldn't see. They rang the bell a little bit when they was going away, but the whole thing was tame. You could see it as a pickup. You could see it was a pickup wedding. And that's also from Minty Alley. As these passages suggest, the author's perspective on the alley is sympathetic but a little standoffish. At the same time, James is slightly detached from his own literary stand-in, Haynes, whose own sense of remoteness is the target of a clement critique. As Michael Gilkes argues, who's Michael Gilkes? Let's look up Michael Gilkes. Wikipedia says Michael Gilkes lived from 1933 to 2020. Michael Gilkes was a Caribbean literary critic, dramatist, poet, filmmaker, and university lecturer. Michael Gilkes was involved in theater for more than 40 years as a director, actor, and playwright, winning the Guyana Prize for Drama in 1992 and 2006, as well as the Guyana Prize for Best Book of Poetry in 2002. Michael Gilkes was also respected for his insight into and writings on the work of Wilson Harris. Back to the text. So, as Michael Gilkes argues, The novel is a, quote, indictment of the pallid middle class who upholds status at the expense of genuine living, end quote. That quote is from, footnote, Michael Gilkes, The West Indian Novel. Yeah, I'm not seeing a good description of that book. Back to the text and footnote. But Gilkes goes on to argue that Minty Alley's least convincing aspect is the easy interaction of Haynes with the yard folk. It is a relationship free of antagonism. Haynes is consulted and respected, and Haynes expresses no ill feeling about the occasional beatings and other acts of cruelty that take place around him. As Gilkes rightly suggests, Haynes' relationship to his neighbors in the novel is idealized, and the ending is a little pat, with Haynes wistfully recalling the good old days. What is a pat adjective? I don't know what that means. Pat in terms of adjectives means exactly suited to the purpose or occasion, apt, suspiciously appropriate, contrived, learned, mastered, or memorized exactly, firm, unyielding, reduced to simpler mechanical form, standard trite. So I'm assuming that the ending, the use of the word pat here means contrived. Back to the text. Minty Alley was published without fanfare in London by Secker and Warburg, George Orwell's publisher, in 1936. Minty Alley was one of the very first indigenous novels of the West Indies, and Minty Alley explores themes: the emotional distance between educated and uneducated blacks, the impact of violence on urban life, sexual relations among the poor that are recurrent in modern Caribbean fiction. Comparable works written by James' contemporaries include two novels by Alfred Mendez, Pitch Lake, published in 1933, Black Fawns, 1935, as well as R.A.C. de Boissier's splendid Crown Jewel, 1952, Rum and Coca-Cola, 1956. Traces of the earlier generation's modernist and cautiously experimental influence can be detected in post-war fiction, such as Merle Hodges' Crick Crack Monkey, 1970, and Samuel Selvon's The Lonely Londoners, 1956, as well as in the better-known work of George Lamming, Wilson Harris, and the early novels of V.S. Naipaul. I'm not going to look up all those people. The residents of Trinidad's barrack yards, portrayed in Minty Alley as being largely indifferent to social concerns, had in fact begun a process of politicization in the 1920s. The circle around the beacon was particularly intrigued by the role that the nation's first authentically mass populist movement, led by the flamboyant Arthur Andrew Cipriani, had begun to play in arousing political awareness. Wikipedia says Arthur Andrew Cipriani was a Trinidad and Tobago labor leader and politician. He served as mayor of Port of Spain, elected member of the Legislative Council, leader of the Trinidad Working Men's Association, and founder of the Trinidad Labour Party. Back to the text. Having served as commander of the British West India Regiment in World War I, Captain Cipriani traded on his personal popularity in order to pursue an unorthodox career in West Indian politics. Footnote. He subsidized his political activities by working as a broker, auctioneer, and general commission agent. Back to the text. End footnote. Arthur Andrew Cipriani's political instrument became the Trinidad Workingmen's Association, a reformist organization founded in 1897, in which Cipriani came to head in 1923 at the age of 48. Wikipedia says the Trinidad Labour Party was a political party in Trinidad and Tobago formed in 1934 when the Trinidad Working Men's Association changed its name. It was the country's first party. Back to the text. Cipriani's political instrument became the Trinidad Working Men's Association, a reformist organization founded in 1897, which Cipriani came to head in 1923 at the age of 48. It was as president of the Trinidad Working Men's Association that Cipriani successfully contested the 1925 general elections for a position on the Legislative Council. Footnote: the Trinidadian Working Men's Association was renamed the Trinidadian Labour Party in 1934. Under Cipriani's leadership, the party recruited thousands of members in the early 1930s. Cipriani was to remain a member of the Legislative Council from 1925, the first year in which a percentage of seats on the council were open to elected members, until his death in 1945, and he was elected mayor of Port of Spain on 8 separate occasions. End footnote. Cipriani, a French Creole, agitated on behalf of the, quote, unwashed and unsoaked barefooted man, end quote, that is, the Benoits of Minty Alley and the Matthew Bondmans of Tunapuna, and received over 50% of the votes cast in the capital city. For Cipriani, Trinidad and Tobago was a colony, quote, being bled white, and the worker defrauded, pilloried, and exploited, end quote. Footnote: See Ryan, Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago. End footnote. Through the Trinidad Working Men's Association's newspaper, The Labor Leader, published between 1922 and 1932, Cipriani and his comrades vigorously challenged the Crown Colony system of government and advanced a curious amalgam of Garveyism and British-style laborism. Guided by these seemingly incompatible doctrines, the paper agitated on behalf of universal male suffrage, the recognition of trade unionism, free primary and secondary education, and a federation of the West Indies. But Cipriani's populism was not as inclusive as some may have wished. For one thing, unlike many of the newspaper's journalists, such as Gomez, Mendez, and de Boissier, Cipriani opposed the relaxation of divorce legislation. More significantly, the Corsican-born Cipriani drew a careful distinction between West Indians and, quote, tribalized Africans, end quote. Cipriani never called for full national independence from Britain. Quote, all demands for social and political reforms were made within the imperial framework, end quote, notes the political historian Selwyn Ryan. And again, footnote, Ryan, Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago. And Wikipedia says Selwyn Ryan lived from 1936 to 2022. Selwyn Ryan was a Trinidad and Tobago political scientist and pollster. Selwyn Ryan has been described as, quote, the author of record for the nation's modern political history, end quote, and, quote, the most prolific and influential intellectual in post-colonial Trinidad, end quote. Selwyn Ryan was professor emeritus at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. End footnote. Back to the text. Cipriani was the first of a succession of West Indian nationalists who had based their organizations and programs around the struggles of the urbanized Afro-Caribbean masses, particularly the industrial working class. Cipriani was still on the scene in his capacity as leader of the Trinidad Labour Party when a wave of social unrest shook many parts of the Caribbean in the second half of the 1930s. Sugar workers in St. Kitts and British Guiana went on strike in 1935, and smaller numbers of workers subsequently engaged in industrial action and street protests in St. Lucia and St. Vincent. Footnote. See Franklin W. Knight, The Caribbean, the Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism. I'm looking up this book. One moment, please. The description, it says that the Caribbean, the Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism, was released by Oxford University Press. It's by Franklin W. Knight, and it says, offering a rare pan-Caribbean perspective on a region that has moved from the very center of the Western world to its periphery, the Caribbean, the genesis of a fragmented nationalism, journeys through 5 centuries of economic and social development, emphasizing such topics as the slave-run plantation economy, the changes in political control over the centuries, the impact of the United States, and the effects of Castro's Cuban Revolution on the area. The book integrates social analysis with political narrative, providing a unique perspective on the problems of nation building in an area of dense populations, scarce resources, and an explosive political climate. Back to the text and footnote. In Trinidad, oil workers struck for higher wages in 1937. These workers, led by the immensely popular Uriah Butler, a Barbadian-born oil worker, were joined in their strike by agricultural laborers and public employees. Wikipedia says Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler lived from 1897 to 1977. Tubal Uriah Butler was a Grenadian-born spiritual Baptist preacher and labor leader in Trinidad and Tobago. Tubal Uriah Butler is best known for leading a series of labor riots between 19th of June and the 6th of July 1937, and for forming a series of personalist political parties: the British Empire Citizens and Workers' Home Rule Party, the Butler Home Rule Party, and finally the Butler Party, that focus its platform on the improvement of the working class. Back to the text. Footnote. The historian F.A. Hoyos notes that the strikes in Trinidad were followed by, quote, disturbances in Barbados and strikes in British Guiana, St. Lucia, and Jamaica, end quote. F.A. Hoyos goes on to report that during this period of social upheaval, quote, some 46 persons were killed, 429 injured, and thousands imprisoned in the course of restoring order in the disturbed lands of the Caribbean, end quote. See F.A. Hoyos, Grantley Adams and the Social Revolution, the story of the movement that changed the pattern of West Indian society, published in 1988. Looking up this book, I'm not seeing any good descriptions for it. Anyway, end footnote. Trade union organizations, youth leagues, and other nationalist-leaning forces experienced considerable growth in this period. Cipriani himself was appointed president of the British Guianan and West Indies Labour Congress, eventually renamed the Caribbean Labour Congress, a body that underwent something of a revival in the aftermath of the strike wave of the late 1930s. A number of those who were to help build the People's National Movement and similar organizations in the West Indies came to political maturity during this period. In retrospect, it seems that Cipriani's labor-based Afro-Caribbean-centric party-building strategy was to become a model for the type of institutions and tactics that were to emerge both in the late 1930s and in the period just prior to independence. Partly as a literary exercise, James drafted a biography of Cipriani in the late 1920s. As we shall find, James found the genre a useful instrument for exploring the tension between political authority and popular mobilization. Through his studies of a wide variety of Pan-African figures, including Cipriani, Toussaint L'Ouverture, George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, James sought to distinguish between authoritarian rule and beneficial leadership. While James was largely uninterested in identifying the biographical origins of political greatness, James was strongly concerned with describing the complex relationship that can develop between a movement and a given revolutionary leader. For James, what was interesting about Cipriani was his capacity to excite the political passions of the Trinidadian masses. Cipriani's obvious limitations and idiosyncrasies remained secondary to his role in activating the hitherto untapped energies of the urban poor. As a still youthful resident of Port of Spain, James sympathetically followed the remarkable progress of the Trinidadian Workingmen's Association, and it seems likely that James contributed at least a couple of articles on sport to Cipriani's newspaper. Footnote: as many of the paper's sports pieces either went unsigned or were signed our special correspondent, the textual evidence is suggestive but not definitive. One article, for example, compares cricket players of the 19th century to contemporary players in a way that is reminiscent of pieces published elsewhere under James's name. In 1987, James told Paul Bull that he wrote, quote, one or two things, end quote, for the labor leader. Quote, I was regarded as a literature person, ... When they wanted a piece of writing, they came to me, and that was an understanding, end quote. See Bull's article, The Making of a Literary Life, in Henry and Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Caribbean. End footnote. In the process of writing this biography, James became convinced that Cipriani's reformist populism did not go far enough and that progress towards self-government was long overdue. The book thus became a formal attack on the whole philosophy of colonial rule, although it had little to say about colonialism outside of the Caribbean. Entitled The Life of Captain Cipriani, an account of the British government in the West Indies, the study offered a broad-brush survey of politics and society in Trinidad and Tobago, placing special emphasis on the role of the Trinidadian Workingmen's Association in awakening the consciousness of subordinate social groups. James referred in particular to the powerful impact that Cipriani's rallies had on the, quote, agricultural laborers and the artisans, the masses of the people, end quote. And James reported that the people were now, quote, alive to politics as at no other time in the history of Trinidad, end quote. James, The Life of Captain Cipriani, originally published in 1932. The description for C.L.R. James's The Life of Captain Cipriani, an account of British government in the West Indies, with the pamphlet The Case for West Indian Self-Government, says, the description says, The Life of Captain Cipriani is the first full-length work of non-fiction by the Trinidadian writer C.L.R. James, one of the most significant historians and Marxist theorists of the 20th century. It is partly based on James's interviews with Arthur Andrew Cipriani, who lived from 1875 to 1945. As a captain with the British West Indies Regiment during the First World War, Cipriani was greatly impressed by the service of black West Indian troops and appalled at their treatment during and after the war. After Cipriani's return to the West Indies, Cipriani became a Trinidadian political leader and advocate for West Indian self-government. James's book is as much polemic as biography. Written in Trinidad and published in England, it is an early and powerful statement of West Indian nationalism. An excerpt titled The Case for West Indian Self-Government was issued by Leonard and Virginia Woolf's Hogarth Press in 1933. This volume includes the biography, the pamphlet, and a new introduction in which Bridget Brereton considers both text and the young C.L.R. James in relation to Trinidadian and West Indian intellectual and social history. She discusses how James came to write his biography of Cipriani, how the book was received in the West Indies and Trinidad, and how, throughout his career, James would use biography to explore the dynamics of politics and history. Back to the text and footnote. The book also, The Life of Captain Cipriani, the book, also drew attention to the problematic character of racial tensions and divisions within Trinidadian society, and ended by calling on the British to grant self-government to the West Indies. Yet John Laguerre suggests that the book contained little that was new, claiming that the book, quote, expressed very much the customary criticisms of colony government, ... end quote. Historian Robert Hill reports, however, that the life of Captain Cipriani, quote, came to play a significant role in orienting many individuals when the widespread labor riots broke out in 1937-38, end quote. Footnote. See Laguerre, The Social and Political Thought of the Colonial Intelligentsia, page 87. In terms of James's own development, however, P.I. Gomez rightly notes that, quote, James had come by now to a recognition of the structural factors inherent to colonialism, ... end quote. See Patrick Gomez's article, C.L.R. James's Marxist Paradigm on the Transformation of Caribbean Social Structure, unpublished dissertation, published at Fordham University, with Fordham University, 1980. Footnote. Robert Hill's article, In England, 1932 to 1938, in James's Life and Work. End footnote. These protests, kindled by a strike of Trinidadian oil workers and fueled by the international depression, suggested that the events were not anomalous. A few of the strike leaders may have read the biography, finding in its calls for self-government an echo of their own incipient radicalism. The peerless cricketer Leary Constantine helped arrange and finance the biography's publication when the author arrived in England in 1932. The book was the subject of some controversy in the West Indies. Albert Gomez said that its, quote, method of criticism is not very significant or sound, end quote, and wrote that it is, quote, good in parts, bad in others, and as a whole formless and devoid of any real value to the student, end quote. Gomez went on to chide James for failing to call for, quote, a classless society, a communist society, end quote. Albert Gomez, editorial comments, The Beacon. Gomez went on to chide James for failing to call for, quote, a classless society, a communist society, end quote. Another reviewer, the writer and labor activist Ralph Mentor, attacked the book for failing to address the economic roots of racial discrimination. Back to the text. Mr. James seems to cherish, Mentor wrote, the notion that Crown Colony rule is responsible for the prevalence of race prejudice in the West Indies. He is entirely wrong. Quote, Mr. James seems to cherish, end quote, Ralph Mentor wrote, quote, the notion that Crown Colony rule is responsible for the prevalence of race prejudice in the West Indies. James is entirely wrong. Racial prejudice will exist under any system. It is a barbaric relic of slavery days, ... It has its roots in the slave trade of the 15th century, thrives on ignorance and a vicious economic situation, end quote. Footnote. Cite in Laguerre the social and political thought of the colonial intelligentsia. End footnote. Just weeks after the maligned biography had been privately issued as a full-length book, Leonard Woolf, of Bloomsbury fame, published an extract under the title The Case for West Indian Self-Government. Wikipedia says Leonard Woolf lived from 1880 to 1969 and was a British political theorist, author, publisher, and civil servant. Leonard Woolf was married to Arthur Virginia Woolf. As a member of the Labour Party and the Fabian Society, Leonard Woolf was an avid publisher of his own work and his wife's novels. A writer himself, Leonard Woolf created 19 individual works and wrote 6 autobiographies. Leonard and Virginia did not have any children. Back to the text. Back to the text. Although this pamphlet circulated far more widely than the biography, it also made clear the limitations of its author's analysis of colonialism. James based his case for political self-determination on the grounds that there were sufficient numbers of educated blacks in the West Indies to assume the tasks of administrative and political leadership. Moreover, quote, the bulk of the population of these West Indian islands, end quote, had internalized the values and aspirations of Western culture, in language and social customs, religion, education, and outlook, end quote. He wrote, West Indians, quote, are essentially Western and indeed far more advanced in Western culture than many a European community, end quote. James, The Case for West Indian Self-Government, 1933. Consequently, the British Crown colony system of government, quote, was useful in its day, but that day is now over, end quote. Wikipedia says, a crown colony or royal colony was a colony governed by England and then Great Britain or the United Kingdom within the English and later British Empire. There was usually a governor to represent the crown, appointed by the British monarch on the advice of the UK government, with or without the assistance of a local council. In some cases, this council was split in two, an executive council and a legislative council, and the executive council was similar to the Privy Council that advises the monarch. Members of executive councils were appointed by the governors, and British citizens resident in crown colonies either had no representation in local government or limited representation in a lower house. In several crown colonies, the limited representation grew over time. As the House of Commons of the British Parliament has never included seats for any of the colonies, there was no direct representation in the sovereign government for British subjects or citizens residing in crown colonies. The administration of crown colonies changed over time, and in the 1800s, some became, with a loosening of the power of royal governors, self-governing colonies, within which the sovereign state, the UK government, delegated legislation for most local internal matters of governance to elected assemblies with consent of the governed, overseen by the Colonial Office and the Board of Trade and Plantations. The Colonial Office gave way to the Dominion Office for some of these territories in 1925. Elected lower houses had their beginnings in the House of Burgesses of the Colony of Virginia in 1619 and the House Assembly House of Assembly of the Parliament of Bermuda in 1620, while initially limited in government even with an elected lower house, over the centuries in some crown colonies more independent authority was given. All remaining British colonies, whether crown, such as the Falkland Islands, or self-governing, such as Bermuda, were renamed, quote, British Dependent Territories from the 1st of January 1983 until the British Nationality Act of 1981. Many British citizens in the colonies, with the exceptions of the Falkland Islanders and subsequently the Gibraltarians, found that their, quote, citizenship of the United Kingdom and colonies, end quote, had changed overnight to British Dependent Territories citizenship, a form of British citizenship that stripped them of some of their rights, including the right to reside and work in the United Kingdom, bracket, clarification needed, end bracket. From 2002, the dependent territories have been known officially as British Overseas Territories. Back to the text. At an earlier point, James finds fault with the West Indians who, quote, live in the tropics and have the particular vices of all who live there, end quote. No criticisms are raised concerning the effects of slavery or the conditions prevalent on the sugar plantations and other commercial estates. The emphasis instead is on the, quote, westernness, end quote, of the black middle class, the fact that they were finally ready to inherit the mantle of enlightened self-rule. The publication of The Life of Captain Cipriani prompted one local writer, C.H. Archibald, to produce a thoroughgoing analysis of the man he termed, quote, Trinidad's best-known author, end quote. I'm not seeing anything on Wikipedia for C.H. Archibald. Published in the Literary Journal of Queen's Royal College, the Royalian, Archibald's provocative critique may be said to constitute the earliest known contribution to the secondary literature on C.L.R. James. Archibald opened his piece by acknowledging that his subject was a talented individual. Quote, he had the reputation, end quote, Archibald wrote, quote, before he left Trinidad, of being one of the best-read men on the island. He studied literature, he studied art, he studied music with the aid of the gramophone, and he wrote, end quote. Yet Archibald goes on to argue that James was all too often facile in his writings and more than once had, quote, slavishly copied a method which has previously pleased James and which James felt must please everyone, end quote. Archibald judges James's best work to be his least ambitious, his short fiction and his sports journalism, as opposed to his longer essays or his biography of Cipriani. He expresses sorrow that, quote, when reading Mr. James, I have felt that what he has set down is not what he is absolutely convinced is the truth, ... Sometimes it seems he shrugs the truth aside, end quote. Archibald's final assessment was rather damning, quote, I do not think he will produce something to startle the world into applause, end quote. As Archibald reluctantly acknowledged, however, and as both Minty Alley and The Life of Captain Cipriani demonstrated, James was maturing as a writer, becoming technically adept at handling a variety of styles and voices. By the mid-1920s, he had assumed the industrious work habits of a serious author, laboring daily to perfect his craft. The obvious question was whether Trinidad offered a suitable environment for this sort of career. To reach a larger and more cosmopolitan audience, to make a living as a writer, he decided to settle abroad. As he later recalled in a letter to Constance Webb, quote, 13 years ago, 1930, I was 29, married and in the West Indies. I had been practicing writing, and I said, enough of this, I shall save £200, I shall go to London and take my chance. Come what may, I'll make it. I didn't do exactly what I intended to do, but I found my way to myself and my place in the world, end quote. James, letter from C.L.R. James to Constance Webb, July 4th, 1944. Or, as James wrote in Beyond a Boundary, quote, I was about to enter the arena in which I was to play the role for which I had prepared myself, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary, page 114. In this retrospective judgment, James's early years in Trinidad were a dress rehearsal for a metropolitan literary career. The clear implication is that James had always known that he would move on. It is uncertain whether James communicated this to his wife, Juanita Samuel James, who was originally Juanita Samuel Young, a woman of Spanish descent from Venezuela, whom James married in 1929. Theirs was a placid traditional marriage marked by a conventional division of household labor. Juanita, who worked as a stenographer at a law firm, was, in James's mind, quote, not interested in the world revolution, end quote. James claimed there, quote, was some sort of arrangement whereby Juanita was to come to meet me in England, but Juanita saw after a time that I did not really need her, and her pride rebelled, ... end quote. James. Letter from CLR James to Constance Webb, 24th of April, 1939, quoted in Selwyn Cudjoe's A Comrade and a Lover, Trinidad and Tobago Review, November 1992. Apart from these passing references in an earlier letter to Constance Webb, James almost never referred to his first marriage, and there is little evidence to suggest that Juanita enjoyed a critical influence on his overall development. But neither did Juanita share his own inner feelings with his wife. Quote, my virtues as a husband, end quote, James later admitted, quote, were entirely negative. I didn't pay attention to my wife as a human being sharing a life with me, end quote. James. Footnote. Quoted in Anna Grimshaw, the CLR James Archive of Reader's Guide, published in New York, CLR James Institute, 1991. Can't find any description of this book. End footnote. The allure of the European metropolis was strong for all the Beacon Circle, as it would be for later generations of West Indian writers. But Albert Gomez remained in Trinidad. Many years later, James and Gomez talked about this. Quote, Albert Gomez told me the other day, you know the difference between all of you and me? You all went away. I stayed. I didn't tell Gomez what I could have told him. You stayed not only because your parents had money, but because your skin was white. There was a chance for you, but for us there wasn't, except to be a civil servant and hand papers, take them from the men downstairs and hand them to the men upstairs, end quote. James. Footnote. CLR James, Discovering Literature in the 1930s, reprinted in CLR James's Spheres of Existence, Selected Writings. Published with Allison and Busby, 1980. I'm not seeing any description of this book, but it does appear to be available on Libcom. Back to the text and footnote. When James sailed for England in March 1932, James was a cordial critic of the system that would have generously allowed James to shuffle papers. A keen student of human affairs, a lover of fine music, James was widely touted as a local writer of real promise. If we group Minty Alley with the short fiction that appeared in Trinidad, the magazine Trinidad, and The Beacon, we can see that James had considerable potential, that James was comfortable with the discipline and challenge of being a writer, but apart from a brief foray into dramatic theater and a few children's stories, James never wrote fiction again. Minty Alley, for all of Minty Alley's strengths, was not the inevitable culmination of his literary endeavors, and it certainly does not reflect everything that the cerebral cricketer had absorbed after spending 3 decades in the West Indies. There is no reason to suppose that James would not have generated other, more accomplished novels and short stories had he stayed in Port of Spain, but he wanted to fulfill his calling as an anglicized intellectual. The centrality of British and European high culture had, after all, been a key presupposition of James's formal education. At the juncture of 1932 and the future, James was in a real sense still growing as an individual. James had become an accomplished journalist, but James's intellectual capabilities were still to be fully explored and developed. James had only begun to consider explicitly political issues, and James's theoretical training was almost rudimentary. The future was unknown. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 1 of C.L.R. James's, of C.L.R. James, A Political Biography by Kent Worcester. This chapter was called Beyond a Boundary. Thank you so much for listening.